Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or on Twitter at sts_news. I would love to hear from you. You know, I spend more and more of my time thinking about the word technology and various problems and dead ends it gets us into. Sometimes I'm of the opinion of historian David Edgerton that the best thing we could do is throw the word out altogether. Some of the worst of many bad roads we have gone down with technology exist in spaces of development and development economics. Too often, experts in development have fetishized technology as a solution to problems in poor countries. They have assumed that these poor countries will succeed only if their peoples live with technological systems and ways of being that resemble rich Western ones. And much of development thinking about this topic focuses on so-called labor-saving technologies that free people from so-called menial tasks or labors so that they can do other things with their time. Laura Ann Twagira's book, Embodied Engineering, Gendered Labor, Food Security, and Taste in 20th-Century Mali challenges all of this. She shows that, first of all, women in Mali contributed to innovation in technological systems in ways that development experts did not recognize. And second, women and also men in Mali do not look down on labor or value labor-saving technologies as Westerners assume they will. Laura Ann's book is a wonderful examination of how people in different places and times also have different ways of thinking about and valuing the technologies in their lives. There are differences we should recognize and learn from. This is one of those interviews where we had some audio issues, and there are some problems we simply cannot edit out for all of our trying. But we still think the content is really interesting and worth sharing. I had a wonderful time talking to Laura Ann. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Get excited. Laura Ann, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Embodied Engineering is a neat book. So, when you're in the kind of social situation where you're trying to give a brief elevator summation of what you were trying to do with it, what do you tell strangers or newbies to your project about your book?
Well, I think that I tell them, first and foremost, that it's a book about rural women in Mali as technological engineers. That too often African women are stereotyped as being in need of technology, right? Development programs often suggest that's the case. And through the book, I look at how, well, actually, women have been innovators and engineering food production in particular in exciting, dynamic ways. And that has helped them really face some really significant ecological crises, including one that was the most devastating for the 20th century in West Africa, the Great Sahel Drought, and that we can actually learn a lot from women in Mali and how they think about technology, not just for development in West Africa, but for beyond how we think about women and technology, domestic technologies in particular, how that can be an arena of innovation and creativity in ways that we never really would have imagined.
Mm-hmm. That's great. How'd you come to write this book?
Well, I had been in Mali before going to graduate school. I was actually in the Peace Corps. This is something that I sometimes talk to my
Okay.
students about, that when you're there, you learn a lot about the program and what it is.
Yeah.
Peace Corps is a great way to learn about a place and the language, and it's a great diplomatic tool. And it set me up to really know a lot about women. And while I was there, I actually observed women working to produce shea butter, to cook on a daily basis, and was just taken aback by the creativity, the way that they worked together. And so one thing that happened in the field that was really exciting was that I remembered having seen women clean their metal pots in a particular kind of way. And interviewing women, I had never understood why, after you put a metal pot on the fire, you do go through the trouble of cleaning off the blackened part of it. And so some of it was, that's when I learned about this shift from clay pots to metal pots, how it was a really smart way to respond to deforestation problems under colonial rule, but that women decided they were going to make these new pots theirs. They were shiny and new and exciting. They made different sounds. So it was something cool for women to have these new pots, and that this was more than just about cooking. It was about women's identity, the meaning of labor. And having connected that to an earlier experience while I was in the field, suddenly I realized, oh, I'm writing a book that's not just about women at this particular development program and labor. This is a history of women in technology. And that's kind of when it hit me. Wow, women are technological agents. I need to write about that. And not only that, they're engineering the rural countryside in a way that nobody has sort of really talked about in the history of the region for the 20th century previously. And so that was one of those moments that hit me like, oh, I'm writing a history of technology, because I hadn't really been trained as a historian of technology. I was trained to be a gender historian, and I was working in Mali in West Africa. And then I thought, oh, this is about technology. I need to learn about that. And so I started investigating, talking to women more about the technology, and couldn't believe what I was learning.
That's so cool. And did you have an inkling of, I mean, not the technology side so much, but did you have an inkling of the topic you were going to write about when you went to grad school, or was that something that kind of developed along the way?
So when I went to grad school, I knew that I wanted to work on women, and I think I had figured out I was going to work on women in Mali. But before going to get my history degree, as an undergraduate, I had studied literature. So I initially thought I was going to go to do Francophone West African literature. But I thought, oh, I need history in order to understand the literature that I'm reading. So I did a master's degree where I didn't actually work on African women's history. And I thought, oh my gosh, history is it for me. So then when I went to Rutgers for my PhD, I decided, no, I'm going to go and work on women in West Africa and Mali that I know really well. But at the time, I didn't really know that I was going to work on women in development. I didn't know that I was going to become a historian of technology, how interesting it was going to be to learn about the material culture of technology, gendered cultures of technology and use. So it was a real process sort of over time, discovering what we can really learn when we look at women and what they're doing with modest technologies like pots, or I look at how cloth and wrapping cloth can be a technique and a technology for surviving a food crisis that I hadn't really ever thought about before.
So what did the research, when you started going over and looking into this topic, you have a very interesting blend of sources. So like, what does the work look like as a historian of Mali and this topic?
Yeah, so when I first got to Mali to do the dissertation that then became the book, I started in the archives, the main archives in Mali, in Bamako, the capital, and they had a series of files on this major project, because it was the major project in the colony under the French that was officially started in the 1930s, but plans for it began as early as the 1920s for this big irrigated agricultural development program. And one of my advisors had said, just start reading stuff that's of interest to you. So I started also reading some political reports. And, very quickly, though this was something I kind of knew, having studied gender history and other historians who also had to go outside of the archives, that I'm going to learn a lot about the project, and sort of its apparatus and how officials thought about it. I might learn some about men and their labor, but there was very little about women. And the same held when I got to the project's sort of home base in Segu, the administrative home base, where they also have an archive where I could learn a lot about. There's a botanist who studied food and taste and wrote a lot of interesting things that when he was supposed to be studying cotton, but he was learning about food, and but still didn't write a lot about women. So I had a lot of information around women, but not quite, in the archives, there were maybe 3 folders that mentioned specifically women at this project. So, but I had always planned to do oral history. And, I started setting up different villages around the project. So I stayed in specific historical areas that had been around the longest, and then some of the newer ones. And I stayed there for several months at a time and, interviewed women. So participatory observation was also part of it, not just the interviews. And I interviewed men and women. And a lot of times, they were also storytelling, not just with, words, but also their bodies, explaining work, how they worked in fields, or how they smuggled and hid rice out of the fields when there was a militarized crisis of control over the fields and they weren't able to take food out for themselves. So that was the first part of the research, but the participant observation, watching how women actually cook, what's the technique, that was something that I also sort of took notes on. And when I returned, I went to the Schomburg Center in New York, which is a fantastic library with amazing materials, not just for African American and diaspora history, but they have a lot of materials relating to West Africa. And I found these collections of African folktales that I was realizing spoke to so many of the questions that I had. And I started looking at them because I also had these travelers' narratives that talked about the region and the environment that I was, was interested in for the early period of the 20th century. And I thought, I don't want to use just their perspectives. I want, how can I get at other perspectives earlier than from, even the oral histories that I was doing with older folks? And that's how I started using the folktales. And so I end up using missionary reports, folktales. I have, archival sources from the project, participant observation. So I just, look at all of it together. How does it speak to one another? Stories that were circulating. Sometimes there were stories that people told me through the interviews, thinking about how they're all speaking to each other. And that to me was a way to get at questions where there's no source that's going to get you that one answer. And so there was a conversation. And that to me was actually really fun to think about, how can I see my sources together, where the botanist actually does record some information about red millet that was a famine food. And then a woman tells me a story about it. And then it connects the archival source to what women are telling me in stories about those sorts of things. And so when I found, folktales about pots, I thought, oh my gosh, this is so exciting that I have this, story about pots. Like they were thinking about these kinds of issues, and that helps me frame it for a period before some of the women were born that I talked to.
That's neat. I thought it was a really rich and creative blend of different kinds of things, and I love the way you use songs and things like this to kind of get your point across. So your first chapter is titled Making the Generous Cook Pot, and it focuses on the period between 1890 and 1920. So I just wondered, why did you choose to start your story there, and what were you hoping to kind of get across as the main kind of background element for the rest of the story that you wanted to tell?
Right. Yeah. The core of the book really is about the period from when the project is established, like in the 1930s, and it goes up to the 1980s in the midst of the Great Sahel Drought. And it's about how women are adapting and engineering their food production system during that time period. And I thought, well, in order to really understand how they were adapting and innovating, I have to understand what it looked like for different women prior to the period of the establishment of this project, because then you can really see, once they get to this new irrigated landscape where there's new villages, they've been displaced in the early years of it, what they had in mind for what they should have been able to do and how they adapted to that. And then ended up engineering their food production system over several decades in different ways to, respond to different crises. So the first part is really understanding what it looked like before, but also thinking about the cultural codes and understandings about food that continued to inform the way women thought about their food production labors and technology, that it wasn't just about, okay, I'm going to make some food that people will eat, but it was technology that helps me bring taste to food and cultural meaning. And that helped me to understand how women were understood to be very central to rural life, to the production of food, but also, to the production of, animated life, parties, festival food. That was something they were also hoping to bring to this project, aside from just, surviving at this place that for the first decades was a really tough place to live because it wasn't focused on food production. It was focused on cash exports. And they were able to turn it into something where people wanted to live. And I had to understand the earlier period, what women's goals were. I mean, you can't be romantic about the past. There were also, food crises in the earlier period, but the aims of what they were seeking to do with, when they're engineering food production, that helped me to understand what they were doing at this development project in the later decades.
Yeah, one of the really nice themes that comes through from the very first page is that this, that cooking was a really central part of women's identity and pride. There's also this connection between cooking and sexuality and prowess in these things that I thought was really interesting. So, yeah, I mean, can you say a bit more about that? Just because. Just to add one thing, I was thinking about, kind of rightly the way that, second wave feminism and such has focused in the United States and Europe. It's been so focused on, rightly focused on the women's role in the kind of the industrial job system, really, right? And management and things like this, that I think that the story you're telling really complicates kind of Western narratives of what good looks like, because for these women, cooking and bringing taste and, it's connected to all these other powers, like sexual powers and stuff, in ways that I think it's kind of hard for Westerners to wrap, Americans to wrap our heads around and such. Yeah. So I don't know.
So, this definitely comes from my training in African history, understanding that the household itself can be a site of power. Different rural households were based in the household. That was where the power center was. But, looking at food in particular, this was something, yes, there were gender divisions of labor, but in men's arenas, right, that they were valued for their specific labor. But women gained status through their specific labor. And the thing that struck me as I continued to work on the book and think about the arguments was the way that women embodied and performed the value of their labor. So the opening song in the book is something, when I found it, I thought, oh, yes, they're singing about how they make tasty food. And that it's young women who are, thinking about marriage, and they're showing off. In this song, they're singing and showing off that they're the ones who make the best food. And it's also related to, a group of young women who are seeking to be alluring for men, that it, in a way, connects to the idea that they're producing not just food for people to eat, but, social life. So it's not only about sexuality, but there's certainly a lot to that, right? Women are working for their husbands, and part of allure is that you're making good food and tasty food. And it's hard to do that when there's a drought or you have food shortages, but women always tried to do that. And it was also a way that you could show your displeasure, of course, if you were unhappy with someone, you could show that through the food, but also just the techniques of cooking, where, pounding millet or other grains or other ingredients in a mortar and pestle is very loud and can be showy. And when women switched to metal pots, they were able to make more of this public performance of, I am producing food, I'm producing rural life, and I'm important. So, because the metal pots had a different sound and they were a bit louder. That's something I talk about quite a bit in the book, that everybody remarked upon when women started using metal pots. Wow, you could really hear them cooking in addition to just pounding. And, so this is a way for women to remind everyone, look, we're surviving at this project because we are here. And not only that, we're making life great here in some ways. Of course, there were always challenges, but it was that public performance, that reminder to maintain in everyone's minds that while there were challenges under colonial rule that increasingly reinforced male authority and status, that women were always also saying, no, look at what we're doing. It's important. And too much of, sort of when development experts come in and they want to bring women technology, didn't understand any of that way, that women knew that their work was valuable and knew that their labor was important and knew that they knew about technology. Not only that, they were ready to show people. And so that was fun for me to sort of examine the different ways that women were able to do that through their songs, through their actual embodied labor, the way that they made it heard throughout compounds in their village when they were actually just doing cooking, that it was something that was on display. And, showing off your metal pot and how shiny it was also a part of that. Like daily visual reminders, auditory reminders, right? It was sensorial in multiple ways, not just taste, but this whole world that women were creating. They were really at the center of it in all these sensorial ways that I found fascinating the more I did research.
I want to talk more about the project and the impact it had on folks' lives in a second. But I wanted to draw out something you've already started to touch on throughout the whole interview. And that's just, throughout the book, you're kind of pushing the boundaries on, even kind of redefining a kind of few common words that we hear a lot in the West and a lot around technology. I think that's especially true of the word engineering, but it's also true of, the word technology itself in some ways. So why is it, I think part of the work the book is doing is trying to get us to look at women's work and creativity as engineering, to kind of push back on tropes that are around in Western development, history. So why are you kind of like, stirring up that word and trying to push the boundaries on it? What work are you trying to do there?
Right. Thank you for that question. And it's something that certainly a lot of folks working in African STS are thinking about. Do we use terms from Western understandings of technology? How do we think about Africa in these conversations about technology in ways that aren't about technological transfer? Someone brings something and then it comes to Africa. Because that really ignores the agency and technological innovation of women, not just women. But I think as I started reading more about sort of history of technology literature and thinking about different ways to understand women, but other folks who aren't understood to be designers of technology, the conversation around users was really helpful for me to say, these women were engineers. It wasn't just women who happened to make pots that were technological agents. It was also the women who were using the pots were part of creating a whole way of making food that was involved in their labor, that had to do with their understanding of social life, their understanding of using these technological objects in innovative kinds of ways. And so when I was thinking about, do I use the word engineering, I had some conversations with folks. I was at a seminar at the Schomburg in New York, and one of my colleagues said, well, aren't they engineering? And I thought, we really need to expand how we're understanding these terms. A lot of folks in the history of technology and STS have done that for thinking about who are designers, who are developers, who are the people who are creating technological sort of worlds. And I thought, if I'm understanding that through their labor that is very much technological, they're creating the rural world that people are living in, and they're redoing it whenever they face a kind of crisis. What is that if it's not engineering? And so it's really about centering Africa in this conversation and saying what we can learn to help us really understand technology in different kinds of ways outside of these sort of Western frameworks. But also it was important for me to say that women are doing this. Because the trope, not only about Africa, is not just that Africa is in need of technology, but African women in particular are just without technology. Yeah. And that, to me, increasingly, it's just so offensive to think about, especially after the work that I did, that they are not technological. That in many ways, and to expand that it doesn't have to be a cell phone or something, a computer program. Right. When I tell people that I work on technology, they think that I know something about designing a software. I say, no, I'm working on pots.
field.
There's some other folks
Yeah.
who've been thinking about, what you might call modest technologies, but they're persistent, right?
Mundane technologies.
The mortar and pestle is one, or grinding stones. There's a reason that they persist. And it's not just because women don't have other options. There are grinders now for grains, but many women continue to use the mortar and pestle and value it for not just the good food that it can provide, but the way that it allows women to showcase that they are the innovators and the users of these technologies, but also because they're things that they can own, that they can call their own, that this is women's things. There's a phrase that I use in the book that's actually understood locally, that things for cooking, items that women use, are understood as women's things. That's the translation of the word locally, is that they're women's things. And that's, so the word isn't necessarily technology, but it's gendered. And gendered in a way that showcases how women are important, and that their labor is valuable, and that they're important members of society. And that, to me, really helps us to understand not just the meaning of engineering and what technology is, but how it's gendered in lots of interesting ways by people who are using it. And gendering the technology to make a stake on the fact that, we're technological agents, because that's part of showcasing how women really are doing all of this improvisation and creative work with different, women's things.
That's wonderful. The second chapter and for a couple chapters thereafter, it focuses on the Office du Niger. So can you it's probably Office du Niger, I guess, is what it is, right? Yeah, my French was especially bad right there for a moment. Okay, so what can you tell listeners a bit about the Office du Niger and its consequences for your story, and how it affects food and the themes you want to follow?
Yeah, so the Office du Niger was a major development project when the French were colonial rulers in French West Africa. And it was intended to really revolutionize sort of the agricultural colonial economy. They were really interested in cotton in particular, because they wanted it to feed their textile industry. And there had been some food crises in the wider region. Of course, much of that a consequence of colonial policies that undermined food production. But they had this idea that they were going to create an irrigated agricultural project that would reimagine or recreate what they thought were the old course of the Niger River with its tributaries, that they thought through mismanagement, the Africans, Sudanese in this region, had not, properly managed, and that's why it was a drought. So they needed to bring technology to rejuvenate this landscape, to produce cotton for French industry and food that would be exported to Senegal. So it wasn't even meant to produce food locally necessarily. And so they really imagined it as this major technological project. It was extremely costly, and it was also very exploitative and violent, especially in its early decades. When it was built, a lot of forced labor was used, and they imagined that it would be a place where they would settle people who would then, they would live in this new place. And so people were displaced, families. So some of the very first women who arrived at the project just ran away. It was a terrible place to live. They would arrive, after, hours and days of walking, having been forced to go to this new place with only what they could carry with them. And women arrived on this landscape that was new, that was this irrigated landscape that wasn't like the irrigation that they had understood it with, sort of what the French imagined was a modern, sleek, technological landscape to irrigate the Niger River. And there were few trees, especially the trees that women used for food production. They weren't allotted food fields. There oftentimes weren't even houses built. They had to build it for themselves. So a lot of women just left. And over time, the women who did stay carved out spaces for themselves to produce food, right on the edges of the rice fields, by the canals. Mm-hmm. They planted trees and sort of made the landscape something that would be productive. And that's how they really transformed it into a place that people could live. But earlier than that, there were food crises with mostly men in households where there weren't enough women to produce food. They oftentimes were sending home to their home villages to get food, send women, please help us. We need someone to help us produce food, cook for us. And so those first decades were very difficult. And it was only through women, essentially, that it was made into a place that you could live. And then after so that's sort of that first chapter about sort of the founding of the office, this place where the French thought our technology is going to modernize. For them, they called it the French Sudan. That was the name of the colony that's now named, the country is now Mali. And they thought we're going to make a modern Sudan. And it wasn't through their technology that happened. It was through the people who lived at the project, right? Of course, men who did the farming work and had to learn new techniques had a lot to do with that as well. But they couldn't survive without women, and they knew it. And it was in the decades after that, when women started carving out spaces, learning how to work with some of the new technologies that they incorporated into their own routines, like the threshing machines, using the canals like they would river for water sources, that women made it a place where maybe people could live, and then there could be some rural animation, and they could feed people. And that's when the project started to expand and more people were living there. They didn't always, make money out of living there. Of course, the French were very much wrong in a lot of their economic policy relating to crops from the project. But women made it a place where people could live and could have, a leisure time. They made beer for beer parties, and invited some of the office workers who were, running the tractors to also join them. And, so they made it a place that, was, there was some animation where people wanted to be versus a place that you might run away from.
Well, I really like how you talk about taste as first of all, the goal that the women wanted, they're producing taste. They had the power to produce these flavors, but also how the project affected taste, the ability to make the foods they want to make it to at first. So can you say a bit more about that? Like how did the project impact what was available in terms of taste making?
Yeah, well, so strikingly, it was a rice production. That was the grain that was being produced if it wasn't going to be cotton. And there were certainly farmers who ate local varieties of rice in the region. But many of the farmers and their families, women arrived knowing how to cook with millet. There were some who already knew how to cook with rice. But for those who arrived and were used to using millet as the base for their meal preparation, had to learn how to make some of the same meals with rice. And that was a process, right? But they were very adamant that they were still going to make food that was good and held up to the same kind of standards. So there's a particular dish, tow, that I talk about quite a bit that was most often made with millet. And it had a certain kind of texture that women sought to recreate with rice tow when they made that. So this new ingredient that was different was something that was part of their innovation, that they're going to learn how to cook with rice. And so maybe there were some complaints. I talk about this in one of the chapters. But they still said, no, we're making tow. You better eat it because this is still tow. And so that was one that really struck me when I started talking to women learning, and I said, well, how did you learn how to cook with rice? So there were sometimes women who had come from families that knew how to do that, and they would share that information. Or you joined a family where women had already learned how to do it. So there was a senior woman who would teach you. And there's certain hierarchies between women. So you had to master learning how to cook with the ingredients and make it tasty for everyone.
Yeah.
But the period that really stood out to me for thinking about taste was the Great Sahel Drought. Mostly the 1980s, but it starts a little bit in the 1970s. When there's this massive drought, there's some access to food aid. So even at this project where it's irrigated and they are producing rice, there was severe hunger. So they even sought out some of this food aid that was often red millet food aid, that locally red millet in many ways was understood as famine food. And people understood the food that was coming in to be extremely poor quality, just the way it was packaged, that it hadn't been cleaned. and it wasn't sort of familiar to them. But not just the millet, there was also, canned fish, things like that was new to women. And they had to figure out, we're producing not just food to survive here. Food security means that it's something that's palatable, that's not just to eat to survive. And that came out in a lot of the interviews. How do we transform millet? If I make it into tow, it looks like blood. So they figured out something that they could put in it that would turn it a little bit different color, so it was a little bit more palatable. And they also figured out how to handle the canned goods that, if they were lucky enough to get them, they could, but it was really salty, and they had to figure out, how do I put this in with my spices, if I can find them or something, so that the food isn't so terrible, even though we're in the midst of extreme drought. And they know that there's famine outside of the office itself, especially further to the north. They know that people are hungry. Even in those crises, women aim to make something that people can eat, that they can stomach, and that it's going to be, as approaching as much as possible something that people would want to eat. And that to me stood out as that's a real important lesson for thinking about food security. What does it actually mean? Well, in many ways, it's assuring that women's labor is recognized as important, and that they are producing food that's not only just healthy for you, because they were also concerned about that, but it's something that you would enjoy, that could be used to animate social life, that it has more importance, and that food security means bringing all of that to the table, not just assuring their survival, which is basically what the food aid in that period was about. Things have changed in the world of sort of thinking about food crises since then. But, women were the first ones to be thinking about, why are you sending me this food that I can't, that is, people will cry if they eat it, is something that one of my interviewees told me. And I thought, that is so stark. The way people talk about that particular moment really helped me to understand the value of taste in all moments, no matter the ecological situation or the access to food that you have. It always has to be made to taste better. Yeah.
Well, security is it's a feeling too, right? It's an emotional thing. So if you you might be eating and getting the raw calories or whatever that you need, but if there's an emotional disconnect with what you've got in front of you, it's hard to feel really secure, I would think.
Yeah, and building that social connection that brings that security, right? That so the food has to be produced in a way that it helps to create those social bonds that do make people feel secure. Yeah.
Yeah. A big theme of the book that runs through it, and we've already touched on it a bit, is that Western development-minded individuals and organizations often obsess over productivity and labor saving in quotation marks technologies, and reducing the physical labor of women. It's often like the target, this is like the big concern, is we have to reduce this. And yet you also show that this is not the focus of the women themselves. Like they want things, there's things they want to improve, but their own physical work is not the big focus, right, for them. And so, how do you explain this kind of disconnect between like what Westerners think that people want and how the women understand their own lives and the value of their work?
Right. Well, I think some of it is also understanding the value of physical labor. That if it's devalued, if women's physical labor is devalued in particular, then that's something that women have a problem with, because they see that their labor is something that brings them pride and status and is valuable. So of course, certainly, sometimes they get tired, and when they're older, they want daughters-in-law to help out. But showcasing that you can do this labor is not the problem. It's that women's labor itself is not being valued. And that development concerns that are only interested in bringing this machine so women, and oftentimes those sort of experts aren't thinking that women won't do any labor. Their thinking is that they'll do cash making labor that somehow will improve the diet. Well, women are already doing cash earning labor anyway. But it also speaks to local cultural understandings that value physical labor. Of course, there's people who want to work in offices and do intellectual labor, and that, of course, was also always valued, right? Storytelling and the production of sort of intellectual understandings was valued, but that didn't mean that physical labor was devalued. And understandings of agriculture, like the Chihuahua dance that comes up in the first chapter about thinking about making the generous cooking pot. There are agricultural rites and dances that were part of the early 20th century rural world that celebrated men's physical labor, but also women's physical labor. And that is something that I think they're pushing back strongly. Of course, millet grinders, a lot of women now are happy when they have access to it, if they're able to use it and they can pay for it. They then oftentimes will do other labor if that one is, if that particular labor is saved for them. But that doesn't mean that they think women's work that is physical should be undervalued. And that was something that was striking to me. You're right, that tension between what often circulates in development thinking and what planners were thinking about, often under the guise of calling it women's status. Thinking that women's labor somehow undermined their status. Well, men also did physical labor. That didn't necessarily undermine their status. Hunting is a very physical activity. Farming is a very physical activity. All of the kinds of work that men did was physical, and women too. And that labor was valued. And bringing that forward into a moment where, there might be some machines and technological objects that will make you more efficient and help you to do other labor. But that shouldn't in and of itself mean that physical labor is something you shouldn't do. And so I think women's labor, that where they're showing off their physical, their prowess, like women when they're pounding millet and they throw the pestle up in the air and clap their hands and they're singing, they're showing off how they're good at that. The technique is good in their labor. And I think that's that disconnect is something that is not just valuable for thinking about regions outside of the United States or Western Europe. That's also something we need to understand and value a little bit more here in the United States. Of course, we don't want people to overwork themselves and to be so tired, but that doesn't mean that you don't value and remunerate physical labor. And I think that women who celebrate their physical labor have a lot to tell us about how we understand ethically the way we think about the world and what's valuable work. And if it's creative or not. Physical labor can be inventive, creative, ingenious. There's a lot of improvisation and can lead to real technological innovations in many ways. And I think this book helps us, my book, helps us to see that.
I was thinking about that a bit, in connection to some of the stuff I read about in the Innovation Delusion with Andy Russell about maintenance and trade work and stuff like that. But also, and this might be a bit too abstract, but I have a friend who, is very worried about global climate change. And, he's of the opinion that, one thing that we'll eventually need to do if we're ever going to have significant change around this stuff is, kind of do more work actually in places where we've substitute energy use in for human labor. Or, more human labor would be a good thing. And, so I was telling him a bit about your book because it just was to me, it was like an interesting case where the work is understood as contributing to society and to the family and these things. And so it's kind of valued and it's in a way that, I think Western development's kind of frameworks just can't see the value of it to those folks and how it fits into their kind of life world or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. And, thinking about, climate change and some of these other concerns that we have, I mean, in the late 40s and 50s, women were dealing with deforestation that came about in the area of the project because the colonial officials needed so much wood to fuel, in the earliest machines, they were wood powered. And women realized very early on that they needed a solution to the fact that they couldn't get, fuel. So much of the book actually is a lot of women's sort of understandings of different ecological crises. The drought in the 1980s was another one. And their solutions were, were modest, but extremely effective in many ways. And they show the sort of creative improvisation that isn't just substituting a kind of machine for something.
Yeah.
But, work with what you have, and valuing the kinds of modest technologies that women had always used that, was able to produce sort of food security. So in many ways, I was thinking, as I was writing the book, I really was thinking about what we can also learn from their technological innovations and the ways that they adapted to their food crisis. Not that there isn't a crisis, or that women didn't, they suffered under the Great Sahel drought from hunger,
Sure.
and deforestation. It definitely wasn't something they wanted to face. But it was something that, they're already coming up with the solutions. And I think that's part of it. But you're right that, the labor question is really interesting. Why, if we're not valuing sort of physical labor, and we're always seeking that, the energy input, that we're not really looking at the whole problem and thinking creatively in a way that how do we approach this in a way that, it offers a different kind of solution.
The adoption of metal cooking pots does look like a kind of efficiency story on one hand, because you could use less wood to heat it up more quickly. And I'm sure, that would be the Western development story of like this transition. But what did it mean to the women who were making this transition? Like, why did it make sense to them? And, why did it fit into their value scheme?
Yeah, the key to that. So this was like the second generation of women who had come to this project. So they were coming to households where there were senior women. They were, wives that had just married in, so they were quite young, and new families, and oftentimes far from where they had come from. And, they were seeking to make their stake in the family and say, hey, I have status, and you can, I'm respectable. I'm doing my work. That was an important part of it. So I'm going to come and I'm going to do my cooking work and all of the other household labor that I'm expected to do. But when I bring this metal pot, not only is it going to help me deal with the fact that I don't have to walk so far to get wood, and I'm not going to use as much of it, but it's also a way to showcase to them that I know what I'm doing, and I'm part of this new generation, and I'm going to set the terms of my labor in this family. And so showing off the metal pot was really important. When they arrived at the office, the parade that brought a new bride, those shiny metal pots were often showcased. And that was different from, the generations of women that had been married before them, because they had clay pots that didn't necessarily do that. So they arrived with these new pots that sometimes the senior women didn't know how to use. And they made their labor really visible in these new towns and new families where they were living, because they made new noises, they were shiny, and they took care of those pots. That, of course, it added extra labor time to clean them, to keep them shiny, to show off, but it was worth it to showcase not just their value as women, but this new generation of women who were young, who wanted to, to shape how their labor was going to, would be part of this new family, that it would be on their terms in many ways. And so they were, I don't know if I want to use the word modern, but they were coming and showing that they were responding to this new world and helping to shape it in ways that pushed back against hierarchies that they had to face of other women, right? There were, it's not harmonious in a family, especially between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law. And so for them, it wasn't just about efficiency and labor. It was making their claim, not just as women, but women in this new generation against, some of the female hierarchies that they had to face as new wives. Yeah,
that's cool. I love that. Hey, I just had a kind of curious question. This is not the theme of your book. So, I wasn't surprised that there wasn't a lot of it there. But the other thing that Western development folks focus on a lot is child labor is like a real obsession, with like reducing the amount of child labor done and blah, 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 schooling and such. So I just wondered, like, how do kids kind of fit in the workflow? Like, are they part of the work scene? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, this is something I came across most often in relation to the cotton harvest, right? So this project, cotton was one of the major crops, and rice was the other. And in the division of this project where cotton was grown, first of all, in the early decades, this was the most impoverished area of the project because you were growing something you couldn't eat. And people who were in the rice division actually resisted even growing cotton. They they rejected even the tools of it. But in that area where cotton was grown, this was also something that demanded a lot of women's labor, because the gendered division of labor usually meant that women were the ones who picked cotton. And it happened at a period of time where their labor was needed elsewhere for the harvest. And for food security needs, women needed to spend their labor in food production rather than cotton. And this was because of the kind of cotton that they were promoting at the office. It wasn't a local variety that had that the harvest was a different time than the food harvest, or the major grain harvest. Women were making food all the time. But so the timing was off, and so it augmented women's labor. And children often helped women in the cotton harvest. So more children had to help out at the office because of that intensification of labor around that time period. But children grew up learning by their parents' side how to farm, how to depending on if they were fishermen, learning how to fish, that sort of thing. So it's part of education. And young girls grew up learning how to spin cotton thread and how to cook the millet and make the sauces. In a way that was more like apprenticeship or education. There were other things that were educational as well. So in terms of the office and what people have written about it, there was just too much. The early decades was exploitative for everyone, men, women, and children. And there were very few children at the office in the first decades because, women who had young children were, of course, among those who just ran away because they didn't want it for themselves or for their children. But that is when it does appear sometimes, in not really in the archives, but that the children were part of that, per se. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your...
No, yeah, totally. I just was like, I was just thinking through the family. I was like, where are the kids in the food picture, I guess. But yeah, that totally does answer it. So what's next for you? What are you working on now, and what have you turned your attention to? I know that this is a pretty recent book. This thing just came out not too long ago, so you definitely have a grace period. That's what I'm telling myself, having had books come out. I'm chilling out for a second, but what's next?
I do have a project that is continuing my discovered love of the history of technology, where I'm thinking about body politics and technology in the colonial encounter, but also sort of longer trajectory than that, how people are thinking about, let me start by saying before this book, I had an idea for my dissertation that was about baby weighing and the baby scale. And I decided to go with this particular project. So I'm going back to that. And initially the idea was understanding women's understandings of children and growth and weight and food. And what the baby scale and the interaction around the scale changed, right? So this comes from my time in Mali before going to graduate school, when I worked at the health center and I saw, how baby weighing happened. It's public. Women are there together.
Public.
Yeah. So you're not alone in the room necessarily. I mean, of course, I have to do a little bit. I have to go back and do some more oral research to see how, if it looks different now than previously. So that's one technological piece of it. But I also learned that colonial census campaigns coincided with smallpox vaccinations. And so I'm looking at vaccination technologies. They were often quite coercive. So I have these two pieces of the colonial interest in population and what people made of it. But then I'm also interested, how did people understand themselves? So I'm going to be looking at town origin stories and how people understood how they came together. Some of the things that came out in interviews that I was doing for this book, people were often talking about people arrived when the water came because new villages were founded, or the way they're thinking about what brings people together and why that matters more than sort of counting in numbers. So it's a sort of vernacular demographic history where I'm piecing together over the 20th century. Again, is going to be from the early 20th to the more recent period, how people are understanding the community health, because that's a lot of what baby weighing is about, that the individual baby's body somehow can tell you about the health of a community, whether depending on whether it hits the right weight, that it too often is calibrated towards, Western bodies of babies rather than babies in Mali or the French Sudan. And I've been doing some more work in missionary archives, and they were doing their own kind of census of who was baptized.
Yeah, right. These competing notions of communal health, right? The Protestants have one measure and the development folks have another, and yeah, okay.
Sisters who arrived in this region were some of the first to do baby weighing because they were interested in creating clinics for maternal health. So I have some of their records. So I'm trying to sort of piece together all these different stories about how do we understand communities, health, people, and how is that evaluated and measured, and what does that change for local understandings when they're up against these technological body politics that are very much about how the colonial state and later, if that happens what happens under the post-colonial state. I don't know how far I'll go with it. So that's what I'm thinking about. How do I sort of piece all of that together? I've been looking at some information on orphanages as well that came out of some of the missionary diaries. But so the next aim is for me to go to Mali again and do some more interviews, thinking about sort of the founding tales and what people think about that, and how they have memories of vaccinations and baby weighing and that sort of thing. So that's where I'm moving with with the next project. So technology is still going to be very much at the center, but in my own eclectic way, sort of like this book.
Yeah, that sounds super cool. I really look forward to seeing that develop and what comes of it. Laura Ann, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it too.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are supported by the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Ford is the Athenaeum Coordinator and Digital Humanities Specialist at VT Libraries, and he serves as producer and sound engineer for the podcast. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.